That should wake you up in the morning. Welcome to the introduction to both progressivism and imperialism from period 7. This would be my first video of the year 2019. Wow. A whole year has gone by since I've seen you guys. Boom. Dad jokes. Alright, so what I'm going to try and do is combine two different thoughts. Progressivism, imperialism in period 7. Hopefully you've printed out your key concepts for period 7 and you have them with you. These are things that are happening literally at the exact same time. And this is what I love about history. Oftentimes we think of history, or it's often taught or thought or discussed about as like compartmentalized. Like history happens in a vacuum. One thing happens over here to the right and something else is happening completely different over here to the left. But they're actually happening at the same time. There has to be some reason for that. There has to be some overlap of ideology, some overlap of force behind those things. Why is progressivism starting to happen in America while at the same time America is pulling away from isolationism and getting more involved in the world? So I'm just going to try and go through this quickly, even though it's a lot of slides. Let's see if I can get through it a little quickly for you. Don't forget, on Edmodo, there will be a worksheet that goes with this, and we will discuss this when we come back in class next week. So our key concepts. So 7.1, we're going to look at two quick things here. So here it tells us there's a growth expanded opportunity, while economic instability led to new efforts to reform the U.S. society and its economic systems. Blah, 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 blah. So the United States wants to grow economically. While they're trying to grow economically, we're during the Gilded Age when the industrialists, your Carnegie, your Rockefeller, your J.P. Morgan, seem to rule everything. Both imperialism and progressivism is going to start as a result of this. You got those who want to now take the American experience overseas. And we're going to talk about reasons for that. While at the same time, people within America, they want to reform society. They see this as the lessening of democracy. We talked a lot about those presidents at the time period. None of them took the side of labor in labor disputes. Many of them were there because political bosses put them there, or the political machinery put them there, not because the American people really chose them. So these two things are happening at the same time. You see this idea of new technologies and manufacturing techniques are happening. The standard of living is improving. That's important because that's going to lead to the rise of the middle class. The middle class begins during the Gilded Age, the latter half of the 19th century. Very important to note the middle class. Many of our population growth is going to happen in the big cities, the urban centers here in letter B. We've been talking about these panics, right? That was one of the last things we did last year, the Panic of 1893. Of course, the Panic of 1873, the crime of 73, and the fight between stabilizing the money system, between the populist and the Republican Party. Eventually, here in period 7, we're going to get to the greatest of them all, the Great Depression. I don't know what's so great about it, but hey, the Great Depression is coming. But all of these things are what's both pushing an imperialist agenda and this growing liberal reform progressivism that's going to happen at the same time. Let's get into 7.1 Roman numeral 2, where we now get introduced to the concept of progressive era, liberal reform. They are responding to its political corruption. We talked a lot about political corruption before the break. Economic instability, again, your panics. Social concerns. How did we treat immigrants? How do we treat women? How do we treat minority groups? All of that is going to be a response, both socially and politically. So you see here, political and social measures. That's what makes this reform movement different than the reform movement that happened to the Second Great Awakening prior to the Civil War. One of the things I'm going to focus on only in this lecture are these progressive era journalists. I'm going to get back to them in a moment, and why the middle class is so important to us. In class, We're going to go over B, C, and D mostly in class. What are the progressive amendments? Why they are so important? What is preservation versus conservation? Here comes Teddy Roosevelt, who believes that you've got to start to save or conserve our natural resources. And we are also going to take note that progressives are divided over a lot of issues, including segregation. Right? But let's look a little bit. Oh, I forgot. Okay, so yes, at the same time, I don't want to start this over again, so I'll just forget that I made a mistake there. 7.3. Now, go over. They hide this later on in the key concepts, but participation in a series of global conflicts is happening at the same time we've got progressive liberal reform going on. Right? And here it tells you participation in a series of global conflicts propel the United States into a position of international power while renewing domestic debates. Again, progressivism within the country over the nation's proper role in the world. Progressivism, I'm going to show you, will eventually shape how the United States deals with the world when we get to World War I, and especially as it happens in World War II, both of which are covered in period 7. But here we get the idea now. We're coming out of the 19th century, coming out of the Civil War, basically the fulfillment of manifest destiny, the rise of industrialism. At the same time, European powers are carving up Africa. European powers are carving up China. They're creating more colonies for themselves. And the United States feels like it's left behind. So a lot of individuals begin to rise with more imperialistic thoughts. And we'll look at that one very specifically. We'll look at each of these very specifically, A, B, and C, here in this PowerPoint. But you get anti-imperialist movement, those men and women who feel that this is not a good thing to do. And our first war that is really puts us on a world stage, which is the Spanish-American War. So we'll come back to these here in a moment. But let's get back to progressivism. The journalists, these progressive journalists, these investigative journalists. You see here, Theodore Roosevelt. We're going to talk a lot about him. He's a very, very interesting character.
Hammer time!
Oh, yeah, it's hammer time. Well, in this situation, it's rake time, not hammer time.
Hammer time!
Yeah, I know you want it to be hammer time, Theodore, but you got a rake in your hand. All right, so he's the one that gives them the name muckrakers. He's giving a speech before Congress, and he's quoting a poem from Pilgrim's Progress, The Man with the Muckrake. In the beginning, he's not very happy with a lot of these people. He feels like all they focus on are the dirty side of life. They don't report on the good things. They're like the man with a muckrake. He wants to go out to water and take a rake and just muck up the dirt at the bottom of water of a lake while not realizing he's stirring it up and agitating it. While an angel is trying to give him a heavenly crown, he ignores that. He just wants to focus on muck. But after a while, Teddy Roosevelt kind of starts taking on a lot of the causes of the muckrakers. They saw political corruption. They go after the political corruption. They go after social injustice. They talk about economic inequality in America. They become like the spearhead of these reformers. But again, now it says in the concept middle and upper class were the force of this movement. I tend to wonder about upper class. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt's a rich guy, so I guess they put that in there. But think about it this way here. If you don't have the middle class movement, would the rich of America really want to do any reform? Or do they prefer status quo? The poor of America would love to have reform, but how would they go about doing it? So it becomes important that a middle class take this on. Doctors and lawyers and businessmen and teachers and nurses, newspaper reporters, all of them are of this middle class. And again, as in all of our reform, a great many women are part of this as well. We've mentioned Jacob Riis in the past. He's an immigrant who took on the issue with how immigrants in America were being treated by being pushed into those tenement homes. And he did his picture book, How the Other Half Lived. He's like the father of the muckrakers, right? And the muckrakers were the ones who really began to look at what's happening in society and really help push along this progressive liberal agenda. Oh, flash photography. Of course it's flash photography. Here we got How the Other Half Lived by Jacob Riis. He would go into the tenement homes using this new invention of flash photography to show us exactly what was going on in these tenement homes. Now, take note of the date. You'll notice why I'm going to point that out in a few moments. 1890 is a very important date to take note of when this book became a bestseller. David G. Phillips is a muckraker. He wrote a series of articles known as The Treason of the Senate. I'm going to let you pause it, read this, because I ask you in the notes, what do you think he's trying to say here? What is it about the Senate he's trying to expose for us? So pause it, read it, think about it, then answer in the worksheet for me. Thank you. Moving on. Cartoons. I love the political cartoons. Now, I know it's hard to read this, but it says up here, this is a Senate by the monopolists. I'm sorry, for the monopolists. Okay, I can't even read it. It's of the monopolists, by the monopolists, for the monopolists. You might recognize that particular type of saying. Of, by, for. Remember, of the people, by the people, for the people. You might remember that. Entrance of the monopolists. This is the U.S. Senate, known as the bosses of the Senate. Here's the senators. These giant trusts, steel trust, copper trust, nail trust, Standard Oil. That's Rockefeller, right? Sugar trust, coal trust. That says the people's entrance. You can't read it, but it says close and it's padlocked. What do you think this cartoon's trying to tell you? Which often appears on our AP exam, by the way, this particular cartoon. Well, let's move into 7.3. Let's get back into it at the same time that progressive liberalism is happening. Those progressive reporters, the muckrakers, are putting that agenda out there. And we're going to talk specifically how others get very involved. We'll do that in class. At the same time, the United States is turning towards imperialism. Right? They start to debate, what should America's role be in the world? Even though since the days of George Washington, we've been based on ... imperialism. There you go. He had neutrality acts with the French Revolution. He wanted America to stay out of that. When he wrote his famous farewell address, he talked not only about, especially, why political parties are bad. Thank you, George. Wish we'd have followed that one. But why it's important that America stay out of the intrigues and the wars and all of that type of thing in Europe. We need to stay neutral from that. Now, some people argue the Monroe Doctrine violates the neutrality, but in essence it really doesn't, because it's simply trying to tell Europe to stay out of Latin America, that let Latin America handle its own issues, and that the United States, being in the Americas, will be the nation that will help and guide them. So it's not really getting us involved in European affairs, it's really trying to keep Europe out of the affairs of the Americas. So here we are at 731A. And again, the imperialists. So the expression the imperialists. So they're looking for four things here. I always do this as a multiple choice question, right? Economic opportunities. In Hawaii, you've got the Dole family. Yes, that Dole family. They have sugar and pineapple plantations. They do not like the fact that the Queen of Hawaii has imposed large tariffs on them. So they influence the United States Marines to overthrow the government. The Dole family does this. The presidents, Benjamin Harrison and later Grover Cleveland, could do nothing to stop this, and Hawaii becomes a territory. Racial theories, white man's burden, Herrenvolk philosophy, all of that is implied in imperialism. Of course, like I said, America is afraid that they're losing competition with Europe. European powers have carved up Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1885. They're in China. They're creating what they call spheres of influence, where each section of China can only trade with a certain portion of Europe and Japan only. America is very afraid that its western frontier has closed. Its manifest destiny has been fulfilled, but they want to now spread this around the globe. Enter a captain in the United States Navy, Alfred Thayer Mahan. He writes a book, notice the year, 1890. The influence of sea power upon history, 1660 to 1783. Think about those dates. What European power has risen because of a massive navy between 1660 and 1783? A little hint, 1783 is the end of the American Revolution. Bingo. Great Britain. What he wants is America to emulate Great Britain, build a massive sea power. He's an imperialist. Theodore Roosevelt, imperialist. John Hay, the Secretary of State, imperialist. All these people are thinking globally, while at the same time, America is embracing liberal reform. These things, in a lot of respect, did go hand to hand, but they were also, opposed to each other at times as well. For instance, the anti-imperialist movement emerged. More strict, perhaps liberal thinkers, they began to argue that America's principle is self-determination. Other people in the world should have their own self-determination. America should not impose its will on others. They also attacked it as a racial thing. They're the ones who pointed out, you're trying to do white man's burden. And they're the ones who fear that that America was moving away from the traditions of Washington and isolationism. An anti-imperialist league gets started. Mark Twain is a famous member of it. In class, we're going to read the article When Titans Tangled, Mark Twain versus Theodore Roosevelt over the idea of imperialism. The election of 1900 is the same two guys from 1896. That was the Wizard of Oz election. 1896, that was all about gold and 16-1, gold versus silver. William Jennings Bryan takes on William McKinley again. He's not going to give up his 16-1 stuff, but now he adds the idea of being an anti-imperialist. And of course, William McKinley wins this election because the Spanish-American War has happened, and William McKinley is seen as a great president because of this. Which gets us to the Spanish-American War, right? America's shortest war. America begins to acquire island territories in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. Right? Hawaii's already become a territory. The Philippines are added to the United States after this war. Cuba, interestingly, as the war is actually fought specifically because of Cuba, you get these two amendments. Now, not amendments to the Constitution. There are amendments to the American War Bill that declares war on Spain. The Teller Amendment came first. A member of Congress, he argues that Cuba must stay independent. That's the Teller Amendment. Whereas the Platt Amendment gets added. Another member of Congress, he says, okay, Cuba remains independent, but the United States gets to influence Cuba. The United States gets to decide when and why Cuba, for instance, will sign treaties or try to get loans from other countries. Cuba will also open up a naval base that will be a United States naval base. In fact, it's still there. It's called Guantanamo Bay. The United States still has a naval base in Cuba to this day because of the Platt Amendment. When the war is a very short-lived, April to August, that's it. There's Theodore Roosevelt. We talk a lot about him. He wanted to be in this war so bad, but he was past his prime. So he creates his own private army called the Rough Riders. The man created his own private army called the Rough Riders so he could go fight. That's him on top of San Juan Hill. That's the famous, they actually first went up Kettle Hill, and then from Kettle Hill they went down and they went up San Juan Hill with the combined the Rough Riders and the United States Army. And he took a picture there, and that's a very famous picture. There's Roosevelt, Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt, and his Rough Riders. The open door policy, as I mentioned, China is being carved up. The United States cannot trade with China because France, Great Britain, Belgium, Germany, Russia, and Japan have China basically carved up. So they write this open door to the world, this open door letter to the world, where they decide China should be its own country and it should be able to trade with whomever they want to. It's a nice thing. Europe isn't going to basically abide by that, but the United States wants trade desperately in China. Of course, they take the Philippines, and instead of with the Teller Amendment, where they allowed Cuba to become independent and create its own government, they decided that the Philippines has to have an American, basically, create a protectorate here where they will oversee the government. The Filipinos did not like that, and a war breaks out between the Americans and the Filipinos, almost a 2-year war. And it's a brutal war. It's a nasty war. It's not a declared war. It's a very forgotten one today. But in the end, the United States tells the Philippines that they will eventually give them their independence over a few decades. But then World War II happens, and we'll get into that later on. The Insular Cases are Supreme Court cases. Insular is a fancy word for island. So as the United States goes to the Philippines, the United States goes to Guam, the United States goes to Puerto Rico, the flag goes. Does that mean the protections of the Constitution go? Well, in the Insular Cases, which is a Supreme Court case, they decided no. Just because the American flag is planted somewhere doesn't mean that those people become American citizens and get full protections under the Constitution. You've got to become an American citizen to get full rights. So that's what the Insular Cases were about. And we'll end it on a political cartoon. Here's Uncle Sam standing on China, and there's Great Britain, there's Germany, there's Britain, Germany, I think that's Belgium, you got France, you got Russia. There's Japan in the back because, racism. But all these countries are carving up their parts of China, and the United States wants open trade, the open door policy. Let China trade with anyone and everyone that they want to. That's a nice sentiment, I guess. All right, don't forget to go to Edmodo, and if you haven't printed out key concepts, do so. And also you'll find the worksheet for here. And I'll see everybody back very soon in school. Bye-bye now.